it could then perhaps afford to give these weight loss drugs to many more people. But we'll have to wait and see.
Nick, thanks very much for taking us through all of that. A pointer, because you can read much more about this subject. It is on the BBC News website or BBC News app, where Nick has written an extended, in-depth article. It's got a lot of traction there already on the website, so head there. That's a fascinating article about the problems that are beginning to be seen about the availability of those weight loss drugs. So that is available already there on the BBC website. Around the world and across the UK, you are watching BBC News. Welcome back to today's Verified Live. Now, the issue of national identity cards has been making headlines, certainly here in the UK, with the Prime Minister announcing plans for a UK-wide digital ID scheme. That, of course, was last week. Well, now Switzerland looks to become the latest European country to actually introduce them. Voters there have narrowly approved a plan to bring in voluntary electronic identity cards. Just over half of those who voted said they supported the proposal. Here's Imogen Foulkes.
This is one of the closest votes in Switzerland for many, many years. Approval for digital identification just squeaked through with 50.4% of the vote. And that's a bit of a surprise because the Swiss government and both houses of parliament backed the idea. Opinion polls suggested many more voters were moving to it. But it's a reflection, really, of concern still about personal privacy. The Swiss value that a lot. They're not fans of things like CCTV cameras and Google Street View and so on. And they actually rejected a proposal for digital ID 4 years ago because it would have been a system in private hands and the data would have been stored centrally. The government went back to the drawing board, and this proposal today stores the data only on an individual's smartphone, and the whole system stays in public hands with the government. So that, I think, is what convinced voters very narrowly to go with this system, but also crucially, the whole new system remains optional, and if the Swiss want to stay with their national identity cards, which everyone carries and has done for many decades, they can do so.
Now, let's return to the golf, where Europe have won the Ryder Cup. We were showing that report a little earlier. Away from the sporting action, fan rowdiness and abusive behaviour directed at the European players also made many, many headlines. Rory McIlroy says the behaviour of some fans was unacceptable. He suffered repeated abuse, as did his wife Erica, who was hit by a drink thrown by an American fan during Saturday afternoon's play in New York. Well, McIlroy says that golf should be held to a higher standard.
What happened here this week is not acceptable, and it's, for me, it's, come and support your home team. Come and support your team. I think if I was an American, I would be annoyed that I didn't hear a lot of shouts for Scotty today, but I heard a lot of shouts against me. And it's like, support your players. That's the thing. So, look, it was a rough week for all of us. But at the same time, we shut them up by our performance and how we played, and we tried to, I chirped back a few times because it got to me a few times, but we tried to handle everything that came our way with class and poise, and for the most part, I felt like we did that.
Well, that was Rory McIlroy. Let's speak live on the programme to Brian Armand Graham, who's the Deputy Sports Editor of Guardian US. Great to have you here on the programme. We'll get to the actual golf in a moment, but let's talk about the behaviour of some of those American fans. How shocked were you? I know you were there on the course.
It was pretty shocking, having covered multiple Ryder Cups now. This was, certainly the worst as far as crowd behavior. It was a level of hostility we don't normally associate with golf. Fans shouting through backswings, heckling players as they walked between holes, and generally creating an atmosphere more like a hostile football crowd than, even a Ryder Cup gallery.
You wrote in your piece there is a difference between atmosphere and interference, so you clearly think that those fans who were involved crossed a line, but some of them who've been speaking have been really unapologetic, saying the Europeans deserved it. So what should the authorities in golf actually do so this doesn't really catch hold?
Well, officials did increase security, on Saturday afternoon. They ejected some fans. They put etiquette reminders on the big screens. But, the cow was out of the barn, so to speak. Once thousands feel, license has been given to behave that way, it's hard to pull back. Going forward, I think enforcement has to be swifter, more visible, and really more consequential.
What's given them the license, do you think?
There's been a change in the culture probably over the last 10 years. I do think the presence of Donald Trump on Friday whipped up a sort of nationalistic fervor that has pushed it beyond what we normally see. It's not about politics per se. It's just about permission structures and how quickly they travel to sport. And, at the same time, I don't think it comes as any shock that the ugliest behavior of the weekend came on Saturday afternoon, right after it became pretty obvious that the U.S. chances were beyond recoupment.
Well, let's talk about the golf, because it was quite extraordinary, because from that moment it did change dramatically in the final day. What a final day it was.
Yeah, it was a final day. The U.S. had been pretty much written off. I know the ticket prices for Sunday went below half of face value. A lot of people had really given up on those chances. But the U.S. made a push pretty much from the opening of the singles, and they almost took it all the way until Shane Lowry hit that 6-foot putt to finally put back the comeback.
For Europeans, just put it in perspective, because to win the Ryder Cup, that is always a really, really tough task. But to win it not on home soil, that is quite something, isn't it?
Absolutely. I believe it's the first time they had won it on foreign soil since 2012. But Rory McIlroy said it himself that winning it on foreign soil is one of the greatest accomplishments you can do as a golfer. And in recent years, it really had become a competition that had been dominated by the home teams. And for them to do it, and for them to do it so emphatically, especially over the first 2 days, is really something of an accomplishment.
A final word on Luke Donald, who of course was Europe's team captain. He's won the Ryder Cup. He's won now twice, I think, as captain. That is phenomenal as a record, isn't it?
I think so. He's really sort of made his mark. I believe it's the first time European captain to win it twice in something like 40 years. So, obviously it's a rare accomplishment, but he's certainly well liked, and he's sort of pushed all the right buttons with this European team.
Just a final thought on team captains, because they play a critical role, don't they, in terms of who they pick, but also the strategy right through the 4 days.
I think they do. It's, their role is sort of more important than sort of meets the eye to the casual viewer. They play a role of cheerleader, tactician, morale booster, general. And I think Luke Donald in particular ticks all 4 of those boxes in a way that Keegan Bradley might have come short of the mark for the United States.
Brian, we're out of time, but thank you so much for your time, for joining us live on today's programme. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, before we break, let us return to our main story, what is going to dominate here in the next hour, because we are waiting for that meeting between Israel's Prime Minister and President Trump. The cameras absolutely focused on the doorway. We think in the next 5 minutes or so, Benjamin Netanyahu will arrive, and then the usual way it goes is that they get ushered into the Oval Office, and then we get the initial comments around the fireplace with a variety of people there in the room, and I suspect we will get extensive comments both from Donald Trump and from Israel's Prime Minister on Steve Witkoff's 21-point peace plan. That is what is going to be front and centre. Katrina Perry is there for us at the White House. We'll be back with her in a moment or two. But those are live pictures. You won't miss a moment of it. We're back in a moment.
This is BBC News live from the White House. I'm Katrina Perry.
And I'm Matthew Amrodiwala here in London.
President Trump is due to meet the Israeli Prime Minister at the White House shortly. On the table, a ceasefire plan for Gaza. We'll have the latest from the White House here in Washington as the administration says they're close to a deal they hope both sides will agree to.
Our other main headlines here. The BBC's cyber correspondent reveals how criminals offered him huge amounts of money if he helped hack the BBC. And a dramatic end to the Ryder Cup, with Europe's golfers holding off a major fight back from the US to clinch a narrow victory.
Hello, you're very welcome to the White House, where President Donald Trump is due to meet Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu here shortly. That arrival due any time in the next 5 or 10 minutes, we understand. The President has expressed renewed optimism about reaching a deal to end the war in Gaza. His special envoy, Steve Witkoff, has drawn up a 21-point peace plan. Now, in a social media post, President Trump says there's a real chance for greatness in the Middle East, and he hinted at something special coming. He's also claimed to have received what he called a very good response from Israeli and Arab leaders. But Hamas says this is a distraction from what it calls the massacre that is happening inside Gaza, and it says it hasn't received any new ceasefire proposal. Prime Minister Netanyahu says the deal is not yet finalised either. Now, the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt is optimistic, and she's been speaking this morning. We can have a listen to what she had to say.
As you know, the president has been working tirelessly on this effort to bring this war in Gaza and to bring this conflict in the Middle East to an end. He wants to see all of the hostages released. And Ambassador Witkoff, Special Envoy Witkoff, sent a very detailed 21-point plan to both sides, and the president expects both sides to agree. So there will be a press conference later. You can ask your questions of both the president and the prime minister at that. Look, the president knows and believes that this is as good of a plan as these sides are going to see. And that's why it's 21 points. It's very detailed. It's comprehensive. The president has been working tirelessly on this. He speaks to, Prime Minister Netanyahu all of the time, of course. He's in constant correspondence. But he's also taken a lot of time to speak with our Arab partners and allies in the Middle East. He met with them at UNGA in New York City last week to hear them out. We've obviously had direct and indirect conversations with Hamas as well. And ultimately, the president knows when you get to a good deal, both sides are going to leave a little bit unhappy. But we need this conflict to end. The president's made that very clear. He wants to see the killing stop.
Is the expectation, though, that the Israeli prime minister is going to sign it today or agree to it?
The president believes strongly in this plan, and he wants this to be the plan, and he wants this war to come to an end.
Let's get the view from Israel now. We can go live to Jerusalem and speak to our correspondent there, John Sudworth. John, the view from the White House is very much that this is a good deal that President Trump wants signed. It's been welcomed by Arab and Muslim leaders as well. But what's the sense that it'll be welcomed by Israel?
Well, of course, huge amounts of optimism from the White House, but a lot of questions, of course, from members of the Israeli government, particularly those ultra-nationalist members like Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who have suggested that there are very clear red lines for Israel in all of this. And I think a lot of what happens behind the scenes in the discussions today will be focused on them, with the possibility that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will be pushing for amendments and revisions to that 21-point peace plan as it is at present. And there's something else to mention as well, Katrina. You know, we talk about these right-wing members of Mr. Netanyahu's coalition, who of course have spoken themselves about, for example, their idea of the possibility of resettling Gaza, of declaring sovereignty, sort of formal annexation of parts of the West Bank, etc., etc. The important thing, the important piece of context, I think, to give to all of this is that there is indeed deep division in Israel about some of Mr. Netanyahu's decisions, his prosecution of this war, questions from many people about his prioritizing of total victory over Hamas, over the release of hostages, all sorts of questions like that. But on deeper, more fundamental issues, not least the question of a Palestinian state, which I think may prove to be one of the stumbling blocks here, Israeli society is largely with him. He is not an outlier in that regard. recent poll suggesting that support for that kind of possibility of the coexistence of Israel and Palestine as two separate political entities has fallen as low as 20%, perhaps even lower in recent months. And in that context, it would suggest that perhaps the optimism in the White House may run into some real political difficulties when it comes to the detail of these negotiations.
John, I can just tell you as we're speaking there, and it's probably out of view of our cameras at this point, but Prime Minister Netanyahu's motorcade has just arrived outside the gates where we're standing, just beyond the gates here outside the White House. Very heavy security presence, as you can imagine. The motorcade is just down behind us here. They'll come up this driveway here and on to the West Wing, where President Trump will then greet Benjamin Netanyahu. The official run of show for today is a little different to what we've seen from leaders in the past, but you never know with President Trump whether that is in fact what's going to happen. We're told at the moment that that image we're so used to seeing of the two leaders seated in the Oval Office, that will be closed press, that will be behind closed doors, so we won't get an image of that. But again, everything always subject to change with this president. The real interaction that we'll get to see will be in this press conference that's scheduled for about 2 hours from now. Again, we've seen press conferences like that cancelled in the past, famously in the case of President Zelensky during his trip, and we've seen them moved to just become a more informal setting where both leaders are seated in front of that fireplace in the Oval Office. That's to say, we don't know exactly for sure at the moment, but the run of show as it stands from the White House is that we won't hear from the two leaders for a couple of hours. Excuse me while I lean back to check out what's going on there. Yeah, very large motorcade there just gathering at the entrance to the driveway here at the White House, when they will then proceed. If I take a quick look at the door to the West Wing at the moment, we do not see President Trump standing there yet either at the moment. So we're keeping an eye on what is going on here. BBC News, always live, of course, for you here at the events of the day. So this is a moment really that has been building up since last week, when we saw all of that pressure on Israel at the United Nations General Assembly to recognise the state of Palestine. That tally now standing at about 150 countries. Just welcoming all of our viewers on the BBC News channel. This is BBC News coming to you live from the White House in Washington, D.C. We are expecting Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to just drive behind me here on the driveway of the White House, where he is due to meet President Trump in just a few moments' time. The President and his team have drafted this 21-point peace plan, which they've presented to Arab leaders and Muslim leaders. It's been broadly welcomed, some changes suggested, and we're told that the Special Envoy Steve Witkoff has been working with Prime Minister Netanyahu's team on some of the details around that. The Prime Minister himself saying he doesn't want to comment on it until he's had the chance to speak to President Trump here. Our correspondent John Sudworth is live in Jerusalem. He's still with us just while we're watching for the motorcade, which is gathered at the end of the driveway here to actually make their way up to the West Wing entrance portico in just a moment. But John, will this be a meeting that will be closely watched where you are there in Jerusalem as well by the people of Israel?
Very much so. For those desperate to see those hostages released, the remaining 48, some 20 of whom are thought still to be alive, this is a critical moment. The relatives, the family members of some of those hostages have written to Mr. Trump a letter sort of recognizing the influence that he has over Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and asking him to wield that influence. So absolutely being closely watched. For some, if you read some of the press reports, the speculation, this is being seen as a bit of a moment of truth for Mr. Netanyahu, the moment when he is finally confronted with this peace plan, and many people suggesting being presented with that plan by a man, the President of the United States, to whom it is almost impossible for him to say no. And also, of course, Katrina, reports behind the scenes that some of what is driving the Trump White House here is a sense of growing frustration with the Israeli Prime Minister. Suggestions, for example, that the strike earlier this month on the Hamas headquarters in Doha was not seen as helpful by the White House. They were concerned about the possibility of the actions of Israel destabilizing the situation across that region more widely. And so, people will be watching very carefully for the body language. As you mentioned, we don't know how much of the interaction we're going to see in public and at what stage, but there is this scheduled press conference. I think the intention will, of course, be to show unity, to show America still standing side by side with Israel. But if those reports of frustrations are to be believed, then, of course, in an unscripted press conference, as is so often with President Trump, might we see those unscripted moments, some of that frustration being aired in public. So a lot of people will be watching very, very closely, and a lot of people will be trying to read the signs here as to whether the optimism that we're being told surrounds this 21-point peace plan is really well-founded, or whether when it comes to the detail of the negotiations, when Mr. Netanyahu sits down with Mr. Trump, whether some of those sticking points, some of those big questions, and some of those red lines for Israel's Prime Minister get in the way of this much talked of hope for progress.
Okay, John, thank you for that. John Sudworth there in Jerusalem. We will be back to you a little bit later. We're just here live at the White House. Very heavy security presence. Prime Minister Netanyahu's motorcade has arrived just outside the White House. It's parked at the bottom of the driveway. It's just out of view of our cameras here, so we are awaiting his arrival when he'll be greeted then by President Trump at the West Wing part of the White House here in the portico. What you also can see just beyond the range of our cameras here, that there is a protest taking place outside the security cordon, which is a lot wider than it has been for visits of previous leaders here to see President Trump. There are a couple of dozen people there protesting against the appearance of, indeed, Prime Minister Netanyahu here, pointing to the fact that there is an international arrest warrant out from him issued by the International Criminal Court over a year ago for war crimes, for crimes against humanity. So there are Americans there protesting, saying that he should not have been invited to the US. But we are waiting for, I'm just going to take a quick check and see, still gathered at the bottom of the driveway there. So that arrival here imminent. While we're waiting on that, let's speak now to Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute. Thanks for being with us here on BBC News.
Thank you.
From your perspective as a watcher of these events, what sort of moment do you think this is now, with Prime Minister Netanyahu coming here with that optimism we're seeing from the White House, and indeed the welcome from the Muslim and Arab leaders for the President's 21-point peace plan as well?
Thank you for having me. I have to say I have a hard time sharing the optimism. I understand that obviously from the administration's standpoint, they want to do something to be able to change the situation. And this is to a certain extent as a result of the French-Saudi initiative at the UN that was pushing for a Palestinian state, as well as Israel's mistaken overreach by attacking Qatar that has changed the White House's attitude and pushed them in this direction. However, we have plenty of experience in the past in which when the Israelis, particularly Netanyahu, has been presented with this type of pressure from the United States, he's been able to say yes, but include as many poison pills into the agreement as possible in order to make it meaningless within months, if not even shorter than that. We have seen that, for instance, in the very ceasefire that Trump helped bring about earlier this year. So absent any clear-cut commitment to a Palestinian state, and not the formulation that apparently currently is in the proposal, which is just an acknowledgement of the Palestinian people's aspiration for a state. Absent something really strong, I find this unlikely to lead anything, even if there is a short-term agreement that they're all coming along with some sort of a 21-point plan that then collapses within weeks.
And just on that plan, within that, from the President's plan, is very much a focus on a security force, an international security force that would be present in Gaza. We understand from the Prime Minister's office that they want Israel to be in charge of the security of Gaza in the immediate aftermath of any ceasefire. How much of a sticking point do you see that issue to be?
It certainly is a sticking point, but it puts us in a position in which, you know, this is not really about fixing the deeper issue, which is that there has to be a Palestinian state, but rather, how do we manage the continued occupation of Gaza? Is it going to be the Israelis that are in control, or is it going to be outsourced to some other force, or is it going to be Tony Blair that is going to be in charge of it? This is the pattern that we have seen in the past as well. It's not ending the occupation, it's just shifting the responsibility of who is actually in charge of it for a period of time.
So given then how far apart Israel and the US is from many other nations on that two-state solution, how do you see any deal happening at all?
Well, I think the same way we've seen it in the past. There was pressure on Netanyahu from Trump, even before he was president, that there had to be a ceasefire. A three-point plan or three-phase plan was agreed upon. Netanyahu made it public at the very outset that he was never going to honor phase 2 and phase 3. The U.S. said that it would. The Netanyahu government then managed to weasel itself out of that, and the United States blamed Hamas. So I suspect that unless there's some very clear language in this plan towards actually an irreversible process of establishing a state, then we will see a repeat of what has happened before. An upfront agreement on something that on paper looks good, but there's enough weaknesses and poison pills in it that causes it to collapse within weeks, if not months.
So in the meantime, where does that leave those who are suffering so badly, that dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, the famine, the starvation, the displacement?
The one positive thing that can come out of this is at least a temporary respite for the people that are suffering under this genocide right now in Gaza. But even then, we have to remember that just temporary solutions that then brings them back into an even worse situation afterwards is not something that we should be grasping for when there is the possibility of completely ending the genocide as well as the occupation. President Trump has the ability to push for that. Whether he chooses to do so or not is a different matter.
Okay, well, we'll wait to see that over the minutes and hours ahead. Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, thank you very much for joining us here on BBC News. Now, let's speak to our State Department correspondent, Tom Bateman. Tom, we're waiting here on the driveway of the White House. The motorcade is parked outside. Prime Minister Netanyahu's arrival will be imminent to greet President Trump. They'll spend the next few hours together. How significant is this meeting today?
I think it's very significant because there is a sense, Katrina, that the pressure has been increasing from the White House onto the Netanyahu government. We had that meeting in New York yesterday where the Israeli Prime Minister met both President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, and his predecessor, the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And I think there is a clear sense now that the Trump administration expects Mr. Netanyahu to accept the proposals that they've put on the table, and they got a pretty excited
Tom,
reaction.
sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you there. Tom, excuse me for a moment, because Prime Minister Netanyahu has just driven past us here on the driveway, and he's just there at the portico. President Trump has come out of the doorway to greet him. You can see there. So we'll have a listen in and see if we can hear any of the shouted questions to the two leaders there as they greet each other.
President Trump, are you confident, sir, there'll be peace in Gaza anytime soon? And the 21-point plan, is everyone on board?
So there we have it, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu just gone into the White House there, greeted by President Donald Trump. You could hear a couple of shouted questions there about, did the President and the Prime Minister think they could agree a peace plan? President Trump seeming to mouth, yes, I do, I am confident, or something along those lines. To those questions that were shouted by reporters. Just for context, there is about 10 or 20 yards of a difference there between where the reporters are and where the leaders are, so it can be often hard for them to hear the questions and indeed hard for their answers to be picked up on the microphones. But this very significant meeting underway there. We're told that we won't see from both men for maybe about 2 more hours to a press conference that will be held a little bit later on. But you never know. President Trump sometimes invites cameras into places where we haven't thought we were going. So Tom Bateman, I think, is still with us there. Tom, you're on the other side of the driveway to where I am. I'm not sure if you could hear that shouting back and forward there. But President Trump seeming to say he was confident that agreement could be reached on that 21-point peace plan now with this meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Yeah, I mean, the questions being shouted that I could hear anyway would seem to be largely about that peace proposal from President Trump, and I think no surprise that he, as he's been saying for the last few days, is talking in very optimistic terms about it. And I was talking about a sense of pressure that I think will be applied now from the White House onto Mr. Netanyahu. They're going to have a bilateral meeting in the Oval Office, then they'll have lunch, and then this press conference. The point is, Katrina, that what we are talking about here is still a framework. This isn't the kind of really detailed work that you would need to implement both what is in effect a ceasefire with the release of hostages, Palestinian prisoners and Israeli forces pulling back. But then remember, this process is about a full end to the war. So what this is all about is a post-war governance and security plan. And it reminds me of May last year when President Biden came out and said that he had got a framework agreed with the Israelis about a phased ceasefire plan that would lead to a full end to the war. It took 8 months after that announcement for there to be a ceasefire in Gaza. That lasted, 2.5 months or so. The Israelis then broke that ceasefire. We've now had another 8 months of an escalating assault into Gaza and increased fighting. So, I think the idea, and they may well at the end of this stand up and say they've got some indications of agreement, but you're talking about an agreement between the Americans and the Israelis about a framework. We don't know if Hamas, the degree to which they might be on board with this. Over the weekend they were saying they hadn't seen the proposals thus far. There will certainly be things in there that they don't like. There are certainly things in the proposals the Israelis don't like, and they've been negotiating that in New York over the weekend. The White House saying this morning, there'll be things that both sides don't like, but the president now expects there to get an agreement. So a sense of pressure, but even if they get this framework agreed, it's still not clear to me how they move from that to the start of the process, i.e. release of hostages and Palestinian prisoners and withdrawal of Israeli troops. Because President Trump has said that this all needs to be a full end to the war. We're not talking about a ceasefire to get hostages released, it's a full end to the war. So that involves having a full governance and security plan for the long term for Gaza that needs to be hammered out before you're going to see the release of hostages. That is how President Trump has changed the dynamics of this.
And the dynamics between the two men, Tom, as well. This is the 4th visit Prime Minister Netanyahu has made here to the White House in just the 8 months that President Trump has been back in office. There's been a lot of talk today about the level of pressure and influence that the President will try to bring over the Prime Minister, particularly on the issue of the West Bank. We know President Trump very unhappy with what we've heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu around the annexation of the West Bank.
Yeah, he said that he won't allow that to happen, in his words. He won't allow an annexation of the occupied West Bank. So that will come up in conversation. It feels to me that the threat of annexing the West Bank is always something that's more useful to Benjamin Netanyahu as a threat than in a way were he to actually carry it out. And I think that, yes, that will be discussed. That's important. I think when it comes to this relationship, there are clearly signs of some more pressure from the Americans. But in the end, this is a relationship that fundamentally is about a military and political one. There is no question over American arms supply to Israel as it continues its assault, and we've seen that escalate dramatically on Gaza City over the weekend, for example. And so I don't think there'll be any question over all of that. Mr. Trump is not going to use his leverage in that sense. So yes, pressure. Will it change things fundamentally? No, it won't.
Okay, well, we will get an indication of what pressure, if any, has been brought to bear over Prime Minister Netanyahu by President Trump when we have that press conference a little later, which we will, of course, have live for you here on BBC News. But right now, the Prime Minister and the President in the Oval Office having that bilateral meeting. So much important issues to discuss. Stay with us here on BBC News.
Now on BBC News, the latest business news from across the globe. Business Today.
Tariffs on a screen near you. President Trump says he'll impose 100% import taxes on foreign movies and furniture too. We'll explain. Game On, computer game maker Electronics Art is sold for $55 billion. And back online, the British car maker Jaguar Land Rover says it will restart production a month after stalling it because of a cyber attack. Hello, welcome. This is Business Today. I'm Ben Thompson, and we start with the very latest instalment of President Trump's tariff series. It is now Hollywood movies that are in the firing line. The US president says other countries have stolen the movie-making business like candy from a baby. And it's an industry, of course, centred in Hollywood in California. And the president used his social media sites to to hit out once again at the state's governor. He has long criticised him. In another post just a few minutes later, he said there would be more tariffs on furniture. But details there were to follow. So let's talk to Michelle, who's in New York. She's got the very latest on this for us. And Michelle, once again, another industry in the firing line. But he says this is about protecting a domestic industry. Just explain what's going on here.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of tariff saber rattling that we've become quite familiar with from Donald Trump. This time it surrounds America's filmmaking industry, notably Hollywood, which is centered around California. If you think back to May, he threatened something similar before, and so this seems to be kind of reprising some of that, this idea of 100% tariffs on film production that happens outside of the United States. But here's the thing, we don't know any details yet, and we don't know when it might come into effect. In the past, when Hollywood has spoken about this, they said it'd be quite tricky to enforce and potentially could halt production of many projects sort of virtually immediately, given how spread out things are around the world. But obviously, if you think about, for example, Canada is a big area where there's a lot of filmmaking that takes place. India and Bollywood is another filmmaking centre, France. So it's unclear at this point. And of course, the devil will all be in the detail.
Yeah, so President Trump says that that's because other countries have stolen some of that work that would traditionally be done in Hollywood. But, you know, if you speak to the movie studios or entertainment firms, they say they're just going where maybe there are tax incentives, maybe where it's cheaper. They may be able to film stuff in different countries in ways they weren't able to do before. That's just a sign of the times and just the way that the industry is evolving.
Yeah, and if you look at California, they're also sort of looking and rethinking their own tax incentives to try and encourage production to return to the US. But more broadly speaking, if there is one pattern when it comes to tariffs in the Trump administration, the idea is about reshoring manufacturing, or in this case, reshoring filmmaking back on sort of home turf, in this case, California and Hollywood. And I think that is sort of part of the bigger project that this White House is engaged in. And so in that sense, it sort of fits into a pattern and an approach to kind of how they see the world and how they're using tariffs.
Yeah, and Michelle, what do we know about that furniture issue as well? You know, President Trump not giving many details about that. It might feel like a bit of a strange one, but what's going on here?
Yeah, so again, you know, the theme is about bringing manufacturing back. Furniture in America for a long time was made in sort of parts of kind of North Carolina and other areas like that. And this is about trying to help those areas bring back jobs. Alabama is another one, you know, where they can't compete simply with furniture, for example, made more cheaply in places like Vietnam and others. You know, people are jokingly referring to it as the kind of IKEA tax, because obviously the manufacturer is sort of certainly popular in cities like New York, but it's part of a raft of tariffs that are due to come into effect on October 1st, so this Wednesday, not just furniture, where we know that they have talked about 25% tariffs, but also there's a threatened 50% tariff on kitchen cabinets that is due to come into effect on October 1st, as well as on pharmaceutical drugs, finished and branded pharmaceutical products, where those manufacturers don't have any sort of presence making those drugs here in America.
Michelle, I know you're going to follow that for us closely, but for now, thank you. Michelle Fleury there, live in New York. Elsewhere, and the video games giant Electronic Arts is to be bought for $55 billion. Now, the company is behind some of the world's biggest video games, everything from EA Sports and The Sims. Well, it's been bought by a consortium that includes Silver Lake Management, Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, and Jared Kushner's Affinity Partners. And what is being described as the largest leveraged buyout in history. That basically means they're going to borrow most of the money they need to buy it. Our technology reporter Chris Valens has the details.
I think this deal marks yet another foray by Saudi Arabia into the world of gaming. They've been investing in other game companies. They've been exploring the world of esports, competitive gaming, hosting major competitions there. This deal, as you mentioned, brings together Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, Jared Kushner's Affinity Partners. Jared Kushner is, of course, the son-in-law of President Trump, and is, on many people's account, a record-breaking leveraged purchase. It's been welcomed by Electronic Arts. Boss Andrew Wilson, who's going to remain in post, said it was a powerful recognition of the firm's work. Together with our partners, we will create transformative experiences to inspire generations to come, he says. Of course, this involvement of Saudi Arabia in gaming isn't without without controversy or criticism, but we're seeing here they're certainly investing in a big way in gaming.
That's Chris Valens with the very latest details there on that $55 billion payday at EA Electronic Arts. Elsewhere, the British carmaker Jaguar Land Rover says it will resume some production in, quote, the coming days. Now, it stopped making vehicles a month ago after a big cyber attack crippled the systems of the company, which is owned by the Indian conglomerate Tata Group. Now, the stoppage is thought to have cost the company about $70 million a week. Over the weekend, the UK government said it would provide around $2 billion of financial support. With the latest on what we know so far, here's Theo Leggett.
This is some production coming back. It's not like you turn on the production lines and everything's back to normal. As we understand it, what's going to happen initially is that Jaguar Land Rover's engine plant in Wolverhampton in the British Midlands is going to start operating because you can't make cars without engines. And then there's going to be a phased restart of its production lines. And those include in Halewood, in Merseyside in the UK, in Solihull, also in the Midlands, but also in Nitra in Slovakia and in China. So everything's going to restart gradually, which means that JLR won't be back up to full production probably for several weeks to come. Now, what this means is there's going to be a start to easing the crisis that has engulfed both JLR and its supplier base. Remember, JLR has thousands of suppliers around the world. Now, those suppliers, many of them are highly reliant on Jaguar Land Rover. They've been in financial trouble. The restart of production won't put that to rights. There are still issues there, but it is a step in the right direction.
Theo Leggett there. Now, online influencing is big business. Just last week we learned that YouTube creators boosted the UK economy to the tune of $2 billion last year. Also supported 45,000 jobs, according to research by Oxford Economics. But the industry is changing so fast it's pretty hard to keep up. Now, you may think you know all about YouTubers, but what about VTubers? BBC Tech Now's Andrew Rogers has been to an event in Birmingham to find out who they are.
Hype's building here for tonight's headliners.
I'm so excited. Oh my god. I've never been before, so this is my first time.
How excited are you for this event?
So excited.
I'm quite excited, but I didn't expect it to be this packed.
But tonight's show's a little different from concerts you might have been to before. These guys are here to see their favourite VTubers, virtual content creators and streamers.
It's really nice to meet other people who like VTubers because it can be a bit weird to bring it up with people who don't know what they're about.
It just seems to get bigger and bigger. I've never seen the queues like this.
It's very much like a concert and gig like all kind of others. It's just got its own, VTuber spin on it. So.
This is the opening night for Vexpo in Birmingham. It stands for VTuber Expo, and Phoebe Chan is getting it all started on the main stage.
I am a 2.5D idol, singer-songwriter and voice actor who writes songs and performs them on both the real life and the virtual stage. I love it so much, being able to bridge dimensions, basically. And now something like this.
Most VTubers are real people, controlling animated characters from home through motion capture tech. A bit like digital puppets, they then stream live on platforms like Twitch and YouTube, usually anonymously. That means they can appear anywhere in the world, including one-to-one in these meet and greet booths being set up next door.
Depending on who you're explaining it to, you get some interesting looks. I'll be like, oh yeah, so I stream video games. And they're like, oh, that's cool. How do you feel about being on camera all the time? And it's like, well, I'm not on camera. It's like, wait, you don't use a camera? I was like, well, no. Like, you know anime, and you can see the look in their eyes, and you're like, yeah, anime. I pilot like a virtual anime girl.
VTubers have been huge in parts of Asia for a while now. HoloLive concerts in Japan have drawn in tens of thousands of fans. Now they're becoming much more popular in the West too, and they're bringing in-person IRL events with them.
Hello.
And they're getting more popular online too. We spoke to live streaming platform Twitch, which told us people here in the UK are spending 3 times as many hours watching VTuber streams all total compared to a year ago.
Like, if it's like this now, chances are we could take this into the future and we'll get bigger and bigger.
So as even more new fans in the West jump on board, this event could be getting even busier and louder next year.
Learn something every day, don't you? Other news for you right now. German airline group Lufthansa says it will cut 4,000 jobs, around 4% of its global workforce, by 2030, all part of plans to boost profitability. Most of the redundancies are expected in admin roles rather than frontline staff. Lufthansa shares are up on the news. US auto parts maker First Brands has filed for bankruptcy protection as it struggles to manage its $6 billion worth of debt caused by a string of acquisitions. The firm has managed to secure $1.1 billion in financing to help maintain day-to-day operations. It's told its international customers, partners and employees that there will be, quote, full continuity of service. And the British and Irish arm of the jewellery chain Claire's Accessories has been bought out of administration by the private equity firm Modella Capital. It spares around 1,500 jobs, but the future of 145 remaining stores and about 1,000 workers is unclear. Modella is the same firm that bought WH Smith's high street outlets earlier this year. A reminder, there's much more on all those stories for you at bbc.com/business, including the very latest on that potential restart of production at Jaguar Land Rover after that big cyber attack. So all the details there as they come in. But that is your business today. See you soon.
Thousands of people have come here to the centre of Seoul this evening. They have come to celebrate the newly elected president, Lee Jae-myung.
He's been firing rubber bullets at the direction of the crowd, and it shows you just how volatile the situation is.
We're seeing scenes of destruction like this one across Mandalay, and the reality on the ground is there just aren't enough pairs of hands.
Given the scale of the attacks we've seen over the past 48 hours, it doesn't feel like we're in ceasefire territory.
There when the story breaks, BBC News.
Welcome back to Verified Live. Let's turn to an extraordinary story now. It involves the BBC cyber correspondent Joe Tidy. He was recently approached by criminals offering him money to help hack the BBC. He was offered a 15% cut of any ransom payment if he agreed to cooperate. It's a story with added significance given the number of high-profile hacks of big businesses and most recently a UK nursery chain. Well, our cyber correspondent Joe Tidy joined me a little earlier and told me more about what actually happened.
Well, I talk to cyber criminals quite often. That's part of my job for research and for stories. But there's this message that was unsolicited came from someone called Syndicate recently. And it was a bit different because they were offering me, as you say, a 15% cut of any ransom if I helped them hack the BBC. And I had heard rumours of this type of activity. They call it the insider threat in the cyber world. But I hadn't really known how it will work. So I thought, right, let's speak to the BBC senior editors and get permission, then we'll carry it on and play along. So we did. I spent about 3 days talking to them, and it was absolutely fascinating. They were very aggressive, very persuasive. They gave me assurances, we will delete all these messages. The BBC will never know that it was you that gave us the login, password, security codes. That was all they would have needed. They offered me, as you say, 15%. They upped that to 25%. They reckoned they could possibly get tens of millions from the BBC if they were able to break in, scramble the system with malicious software like ransomware, or steal lots of data and carry out an extortion attack. They even said, I said at one stage, hang on a minute, you could be kids mucking around. How do I know you're serious? And they said, well, log on to this Russian cybercrime forum and we'll put half a Bitcoin down as a deposit, $55,000. So I think it was pretty serious, the whole experience. And what was interesting as well was they sent me 2 links to recent cyber attacks, news articles about them, that they claimed that they had come about because of deals like this.
Yes, they boasted, didn't they, that they had had success with this sort of technique. We don't know if that's particularly true, but worrying if it is. So what happened next in the story?
Well, after a few days of talking to them, they were increasingly pressuring me to do the next step, which was they wanted me to run some code on my laptop, which would allow them to kind of start the reconnaissance mission of finding out which IT networks I was a part of, what sort of access they would have if I gave them access. I don't have high-level IT access, I'm just a reporter. They didn't know that, it seems. So I didn't want to run that command just in case it caused any issues. I wanted to talk to the BBC Information Security team. But they ran out of patience, the hackers, and they started effectively trying to force my hand. They carried out what we call an MFA bomb, a multi-factor authentication bomb, which means they tried to reset my password over and over and over again, pop-ups coming up on my phone. For about 2 hours, I couldn't even look at my phone, I couldn't use it in case I accidentally pressed accept, and they'd have been in. Of course, the danger there is, of course, with this kind of attack, is that the IT team here, the security team, wouldn't have seen it as unusual. They'd have seen me logging in abroad, not that unusual, and it could have been potentially serious. But I didn't do anything, of course. I was in control the whole time. It was unsettling, though, as an experience.
Just a final thought then, why do you think they targeted you? And in terms of trying to combat hackers, groups like this, how difficult is it to pursue groups like this?
It's really hard. People often say to me, well, how can you can talk to these cyber criminals? Why can't we arrest them? There's something, it's very different talking to cyber criminals and then finding out who they are, where they are. And it's the where quite often, because a lot of this cyber criminality occurs in countries, for example, in Russia, where you haven't got any powers to go and arrest them. The reason they got in touch with me, I don't know, but I think it's possibly because I'm known, my number's out there, not only my number, but my Signal number. And of course, Signal is a very secure messaging service, so it would mean that they have a secure way of contacting me. But I'm still not sure whether or not they knew I was a reporter, or whether or not they thought I was some sort of cybersecurity worker for the BBC. And it's a very fascinating insight into the kind of this side of cybercrime that you just don't hear about.
Well, that was Joe Tuddy, our cyber correspondent, an astonishing story there. Let's return to our main news. About 40 minutes ago, we saw Israel's Prime Minister arriving at the White House. These are the pictures from the last little while. There's Donald Trump waiting for the arrival. We saw smiles and a handshake and a couple of shouted questions from reporters saying to the president, "Are you confident of a peace deal in Gaza?" And Donald Trump responding, saying he is very confident. But of course, he has said that before. And of course, one of the things that they will be discussing immediately is Steve Witkoff's 21-point peace plan. And that, of course, gives great detail. Let me show you the live pictures, though, from the White House, because they've gone into a closed session. There's a news conference in about, we think, about an hour, hour and a half's time. So we'll get details. So no Oval Office pictures with initial comments. They have got straight into the detail. There is so much to actually get through with the US president very, very keen to persuade Benjamin Netanyahu to sign up to this deal. But Tom Bateman was saying the best that can hope for here is that some sort of framework is agreed between the US and the Israelis. There are protests going on at the White House. These the pictures of that. That's just a little way away from the White House. So that is going on. We'll be back live with Katrina Perry at the White House in about 10 minutes to take you through the very latest on that, our main story.
I was a lifeguard since I was about 16, and it drove me crazy that we didn't have a tool to help search for a kid in an open body water, except for goggles.
Carlin's experience pushed her to create AquaEye, a handheld sonar device that uses AI to quickly locate people underwater during search and rescue operations.
I wanted a tool that a 16-year-old kid could grab, jump in the water, scan, and quickly find a child in need. You can scan the area of a football field, American football field, in a minute. It is reducing amounts of search times by 90%. We've trained it using many, many situations where humans are in the water to identify what an echo return looks like from a human being versus other objects in the water, so that when a rescuer enters the water and does a scan, data can be analyzed on the spot and start identifying potential targets.
The device has now been used when disasters struck around the world, including recently when serious flooding hit the American state of Texas.
You can't enter that body of water with a boat. There's so many, nooks and crannies to get around. Being able to have this thing in your hand and move it around is a huge benefit.
Time for us to get our wetsuits on and put it to the test. Carlin's colleague Wiley will be our target. And there's also a dummy floating around somewhere beneath the surface.
Hold in whatever hand's comfortable. The other hand's going to kind of brace it. Pull the trigger, and then as you rotate left to right, you're going to start seeing that feedback bar, that black area, fill up. If you go too fast, there will be a gap in that.
I'm getting some gaps.
Yeah, that's okay. You can go back and capture them, and then keep going. And then when you're done your scan, you just simply let go of the trigger, and then it will analyze the results.
So there we are. In the space of about 30 seconds, we've scanned the area from that wall to that wall.
Yeah.
And it's picked up a target in the water.
And that right there is Wiley, who's out in the water. So if I put the device back in the water and I turn until the cursor is going right through him, this is the direction I would need to swim and go capture him, and he's about 15 meters away.
You can now go over there, dive down, and check to see if it's what you're looking for.
Exactly.
What about that dummy we let go in the water a few minutes ago?
Sometimes will be picked up as an X, which is what our algorithm determines as a high likelihood of a human. And sometimes it will show as an O, which is an object of interest, but has a less likelihood of being a human. It's just a dummy is not as human-like as a human. It's absolutely not perfect. It does have false positives. However, we're constantly improving it to do better and better. And the more training you have with the device, the more efficient and effective you can be. A lot of our customers are using it in recovery simply because they are teams that arrive much after the fact. Our goal is to have it on scene, available in the moment that somebody needs to be rescued.
Where the device has been used to recover a body, what difference does that make to their families or friends or those that have been involved in the rescue?
We've had so many stories, incredibly difficult stories to hear, that we've made a massive difference, that they've had closure, they've been able to find loved ones and bring them home. We have had countless stories as well from our customers where they have lost partners on job. We're vastly reducing the amount of time that they're in those risk zones and therefore saving their lives as well.
But not every search and rescue team has an AquaEye device.
Developing tech that gets used in water is always going to be full of challenges. There's other objects in the water, there's tides, there's currents, and that's always going to impact the accuracy. But as technology develops, so too will these devices, and that means they'll make a real difference in real-world rescues.
Thousands of people have come here to the centre of Seoul this evening. They have come to celebrate the newly elected president, Lee Jae-myung.
He's been firing rubber bullets at the direction of the crowd, and it shows you just how volatile the situation is.
We're seeing scenes of destruction like this one across Mandalay, and the reality on the ground is there just aren't enough pairs of hands.
Given the scale of the attacks we've seen over the past 48 hours, it doesn't feel like we're in ceasefire territory.
There when the story breaks, BBC News.
This is BBC News live from the White House. I'm Katrina Perry.
And I'm Matthew Emerly-Waller here in London.
President Trump is meeting the Israeli Prime Minister right now at the White House. On the table, a ceasefire plan for Gaza. We'll have the latest from here at the White House as President Trump says they're close to a deal he hopes both sides will agree to.
Our other main headlines here. The Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, tells the Labour conference she will do whatever it takes to secure the UK's borders, confirming an increased threshold for indefinite leave to remain.
Yeah, day 2 at the Labour Party conference here in Liverpool, and the Home Secretary says migrants must earn the right to live in the UK, while the Chancellor warns of tough choices to come.
The BBC's cyber correspondent reveals how criminals offered him huge amounts of money if he helped hack the BBC. And a dramatic end to the Ryder Cup, with Europe's golfers holding off a major fight back from the US to clinch a narrow victory.
Hello, you're very welcome to the White House. Well, in the last hour, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has met President Donald Trump here. That meeting is ongoing. The President greeted Prime Minister Netanyahu as he left his car. Several journalists tried to shout questions, asking how confident they were about an agreement that could end the war in Gaza. President Trump said he was very confident, and both men held their thumbs up before entering the White House to begin that meeting. President Trump had previously commented that he felt a deal was very close, with his special envoy Steve Witkoff drawing up a 21-point peace plan. Well, joining me now is our correspondent John Sudworth, who is in Jerusalem, and our State Department correspondent Tom Bateman, who is here at the White House. Tom, to you first. These discussions are ongoing. We're told there'll be a press conference later when we'll get the chance to ask questions. But what are the range of potential options available to these leaders today? Is talks of a deal, that kind of talk, is that premature?
Yeah, I mean, what President Trump is saying is that he thinks they're close to a deal to end the war. Remember that he's shifted fundamentally the dynamics around this. What we had previously under the last administration was always an attempt to get an end to the war in phases. So you would have a series of phased ceasefires during which you get hostages out. But President Trump basically ended that way of doing things. He said he wanted to do it all in one go, get all the hostages out in a 48-hour period. But the other side of that is that he says it's an end to the war. It's not a ceasefire. So that means you have to have a governance, security and redevelopment plan all in place before you get, to that first base, the release of the remaining hostages and Palestinian prisoners released in exchange, and the Israelis beginning to withdraw from parts of Gaza. So what he's come up with is basically here a framework, a 21-point plan, as he puts it, to do all of that. But the point is, this is a framework. This isn't the sort of very detailed work that means that hostages start to be released in a couple of days' time and Palestinian prisoners and Israeli tanks withdrawing. We're not at that stage at all. So what he's saying is he thinks he's got to deal with the Israelis, between the Americans and the Israelis, to get that framework agreed. The Arab leaders that he met last week at the United Nations were pretty confident about this because they've got him to dispose of the Riviera idea, that idea of expelling Palestinians from Gaza. So they like the plan, but that doesn't mean that Hamas is anywhere near to accepting it, and it's not entirely clear that they've seen all of this yet either. So I think expectations are being raised significantly by the president, but that doesn't mean we're anywhere near to an implementable plan. And just quickly, remember, I was saying an hour ago, President Biden came up with a framework in May last year. That was a framework for discussions, a bit like what this is. It took 8 months of negotiations on and off before they got to a ceasefire.
Okay, and John, from the perspective in Israel, obviously there's huge domestic pressure on the Prime Minister. The incursion is ongoing in Gaza as we speak. What will a win from today look like for him?
Well, it's very difficult, Katrina. I mean, as Tom was saying there, there will be real questions being asked, not just within Mr. Netanyahu's own governing cabinet, but Israeli society more widely. Essentially, what this looks like on the surface is a broad principled peace plan, a ceasefire in exchange for an immediate and unconditional release of the hostages, an agreement from Israel to withdraw its troops from Gaza, and then mechanisms to move towards some kind of security situation and a returning of governance to Palestinians in some form, and with Hamas agreeing to disarm. Much of that, of course, could be welcomed on both sides, but the devil, as always, will be in the detail. Questions of how you build trust, how do you convince Hamas that after the release of hostages, Israel won't return to the war? How do you convince the Israeli government that Hamas is serious about disarmament? All of those questions, not to mention some of the real stumbling blocks in terms of those questions about future governance that have long, of course, been almost intractable, long-running divisions over this, that have fueled this conflict for generations. The question of working towards the idea of Palestinian statehood. Benjamin Netanyahu says that is a red line for him. It has always been a red line for him throughout his political career. So really, lots of big questions. He is under pressure, of course, domestically, particularly over his decision to continue with the ground offensive in Gaza. Many people here, not least the relatives of the hostages still being held there, believe that this action, far from making it more likely that their loved ones will be saved, further endangers them. But that doesn't mean at the same time they are skeptical, that they're not skeptical about questions about peace with the Palestinians. They are deeply skeptical, so he is not an outlier in that regard either.
And just while we've been chatting with you, John, there we were looking at some of those live pictures of protests taking place in Tel Aviv. And Tom, there are protests here outside the White House as well, people protesting against Prime Minister Netanyahu even being in the United States because, of course, he is subject to an international arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court.
Yeah, everywhere he goes, of course, in America, protests follow. We saw that in New York last week. We've seen it here today in Washington. The International Criminal Court last week issued arrest warrants for Mr. Netanyahu, his then Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, as well as a leader of Hamas, now thought to be dead. For the Israeli leader, the allegations are over the war crimes of using starvation as a method of warfare and the crimes against humanity of murder and persecution. He, of course, has always categorically rejected it, accused the court of being anti-Israel. And that's something that the Trump administration has punished the court for with an increasing set of sanctions. But, of course, it doesn't take away from the growing sense of international isolation for the Israeli leader. We saw that with that walkout at the United Nations last week. although there are those that say this entire situation, the devastation on the ground in Gaza, what Israel has inflicted in Gaza City, has created one of the biggest crises for statecraft and diplomacy, because even some of those countries that are isolating Mr. Netanyahu by walking out, being vocally critical of him, still at the same time have maintained significant diplomatic and political relationships, even in some cases weapon supply relationships with the Israelis.
Of course, all the while that dire humanitarian crisis for the civilians in Gaza as well. Tom Bateman and John Sudworth, thank you both for that. We will have lots more from the White House later on. That meeting is underway between the President and the Prime Minister as we speak. We are expecting both men to hold a press conference in a little over an hour's time and to take a lot of questions from the journalists gathered here. And there are plenty of journalists gathered here, I can tell you. We will, of course, have that live for you here on BBC News. But for now, Matthew, it's over to you.
Katrina, thanks very much. If there is any development later this hour, we'll be straight back to you. Let's turn to British politics, because the Chancellor Rachel Reeves has warned that the UK is facing further tests and hard choices as she prepares for the budget in November. In her speech to the Labour Party conference in Liverpool, she said Labour was committed to economic responsibility as speculation continues over which taxes could rise to meet her own borrowing rules. Here's more of what she said.
We're putting Britain first, empowering us to prioritise British-built ships and British-forged steel, strengthening our national economic security and creating good manufacturing jobs here in Britain. Because where things are made and who makes them does matter. And as we build those new railways and new roads, the new power stations and new runways for this generation and the next, we want the security and the good unionised jobs that come from making things here in Britain.
Well, that was the Chancellor. The Home Secretary has also addressed the conference in Liverpool, outlining her migration plan with a series of new conditions people will have to meet to qualify for indefinite leave to remain.
Increase the time in which someone must have lived in this country to earn indefinite leave to remain from 5 years to 10. And we will be consulting on this change soon, and as part of that consultation, I will be proposing a series of new tests, such as being in work, making national insurance contributions, not taking a penny in benefits, learning English to a high standard, having no criminal record, and finally, that you have truly given back to your community, such as by volunteering your time to a local cause.
Well, that was the Home Secretary. Let's go live to the conference, live to our political correspondent Alex Forsyth. And let's start, Alex, with what we heard just there. How has all of that gone down?
Well, you can see the conference has just wrapped up day two, Matthew, which is why you've got this flood of delegates just leaving the floor now. A lot of them would have been in the hall to watch that speech from Shabana Mahmood, where she was really making the case that in order to be the open, tolerant country that she wants Britain to be, there had to be control of borders. She said that some people in the Labour Party movement might not like everything that she did, but she was prepared to be a tough Home Secretary, in her words, a tough Labour Home Secretary. And you heard there some of the changes that she's proposing to that status, that indefinite leave to remain status, which gives people the right to stay in the UK after a period of time, making it longer before they can apply for that and tightening the conditions around it. So we heard from Shabana Mahmood on this busy day. We also heard from the Chancellor Rachel Reeves. Now, her argument was based on this framing of investment, as she called it, under Labour versus decline of some of the other parties, political parties. She talked up Labour's record in government so far, but she also signalled there will be difficult choices to come. And of course, we know there is that budget on the horizon, and Rachel Reeves not ruling out some form of tax rises. We can talk about all of this with Izzy Waite and Orlando Morley, both from the Labour Students' Movement. Thank you so much for being with us. Day two of this Labour Party conference. Let's start with the Home Secretary, Shabana Shabana Mahmood's speech, Izzy. She did say people might not like everything that she's going to do, but she was prepared to be tough. What did you make of her speech?
I think you were completely right the way you said that Shabana herself has said this is her Labour approach to it. I think there's a misconception that Labour is able to get to grips with immigration and get to grips with our borders, and I think that is completely not the case. And we have seen since she took on this brief, she has absolutely been realistic about the challenges that we're facing, but has set out, I think, a very firm approach, and that is exactly what this country needs. And I think in terms of our membership, it actually is something that people are willing to see, something that people are realistic, that they know that to sort out a lot of the problems that this country is facing, we do need to get to grips with our borders.
Orlando, one of the things she said was that the speed and scale of immigration had frayed public trust. There are clearly people here that will recognise that perspective, but there are others that want to hear the positive case for immigration as well. Do you think that Shabana Mahmood got the balance right in what she was saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that as a party we have to make a positive case for immigration as well, while keeping our borders secure and, as you said, keeping people to have faith in our systems and the country as a whole. And I think that she's really struck that balance, and she's got off to a great start as Home Secretary.
It was a busy day today here at conference. The other really significant speech, there were several, but another big one was from the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. And while her tone overall was trying to be quite upbeat, the message behind it was that there's a difficult budget on the horizon. Were you feeling confident after Rachel Reeves left the conference platform, Izzy?
Yes, absolutely. I think her speech resonated really well. I've heard really positive things from members who were in the hall, including young members. I would point especially to her pledge for a library in every primary school. I think that's so reassuring, as we know that investing in early years education and in children is just so important to allow them to thrive.
And ever so briefly, Orlando, tomorrow is the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, big speech. What are you wanting to hear from him?
I'm looking forward to hearing how he's going to tackle reform and how he's going to set out the case for a Labour government that's investing in our communities and in people across the country, and will put faith back in, our systems and our communities.
Thank you both so much. Izzy Waite and Orlando Morley, two of Labour's young students. Busy day at conference, another busy day tomorrow. Matthew.
Alex, thanks for taking us through all of that. Well, with me here is our economics editor, Faisal Islam. And Faisal, you were listening to the Chancellor a little earlier. She talked about further tests, hard choices. Your interpretation of what you heard?
It's a sort of low-level, preemptive attempt, I think, to make the case for tax rises if they are needed. And there's still a big if on this. There's a sort of, in terms of the extent and where they're going to go, loads of speculation and questions about, is VAT going to go up, is income tax? I think what you heard there was, if you like, the contours, the tram lines of an argument that probably will be needed to be made, and the preemptive blame that the Chancellor seeks to kind of point the direction, people's direction in order. And that is the global environment, she would argue, in terms of trade wars, actual wars, the global rise in government bond interest rates, the interest rates that governments pay. And then there's this other sort of, I think perhaps the main event, arguably this week, even more important than the speeches, actually, for the government, is this process going on in the background of the Office of Budget Responsibility, the key forecaster, the key independent forecaster, assessing the long-term growth, the underlying growth of the British economy, which is an assessment of what has happened over the past decade or so. That is coming out worse than expected. Well, sorry, worse than currently expected, I should say, in line with other forecasters. And that could open up an even bigger gap for the Chancellor in order to fill to meet her own borrowing rules.
I'll come back to that final thought in a moment, but she talked in that speech of economic responsibility, whilst government loyalists continue to attack Andy Burnham for using that phrase that ministers are in hock to the bond market. So it was interesting, just the juxtaposition of those things.
Yes, and government loyalists definitely jumped on that phrasing. I mean, she clearly, in her speech and in her interviews today, has sought to kind of remake the purpose, as she sees it, of this government, which is having stability in the economy and in politics, and then trying to invest, and then trying to rebuild public services. But clearly, I think, there was also an admission that hasn't been gotten, in a way, right, because you have this almost process of chasing their tails. As soon as one budget comes up, we're almost, as we are doing now even, trying to work out when the next set of budget changes are going to be. And I suspect that is probably what Andy Burnham was pointing towards. It's that process of like just constant and there's two ways to deal with that. You could try and spend more and you will invite potentially the wrath of the bond markets, or you could just try and deal with the issue credibly and then assess it only one time a year. She's given some substance to the idea that they're going to change the frequency of how often they go through this process. It has been twice a year. It's probably going to be in some form once a year. That's what she indicated today.
So as well as the hints of more pain, just a final assessment on what the financial backdrop ahead of November is currently looking like.
Well, the official forecast will drop in the Treasury inbox, in the Chancellor's inbox on Friday. I think the assumption is that it shows a gap of between 20 and 30 billion pounds. There's a lot of moving parts. I remember speaking to a previous Chancellor who said that this target moved within a month, 50 billion pounds. So, you know, an optimist in the Treasury might say, well, it might move in our direction. We don't think that's where it's going to go. But they're having to make up a considerable gap if things stand where they are. And that's where we expect things to be. But the truth is, we'll only know, and a lot of these arguments only crystallise and become very real internally within government when that forecast comes on Friday.
Faisal, thanks for taking us through all of that. Thank you. We're about to take a short break around the world and across the UK. You're watching BBC News. Welcome back to Verified Live here on BBC News. Let's turn to an extraordinary story now involving the BBC's cyber correspondent Joe Tidy. Well, he was recently approached by criminals offering him money to help hack the BBC. He was offered a 15% cut of any ransom payment if he agreed to cooperate. It's a story with added significance, of course, given a number of high-profile hacks of big businesses and most recently a UK nursery chain. Well, Joe Tidy joined me a little earlier and told me more about what actually happened.
Well, I talk to cyber criminals quite often. That's part of my job for research and for stories. But there's this message that was unsolicited came from someone called Syndicate recently. And it was a bit different because they were offering me, as you say, a 15% cut of any ransom if I helped them hack the BBC. And I had heard rumours of this type of activity. They call it the insider threat in the cyber world. But I hadn't really known how it will work. So I thought, right, let's speak to the BBC senior editors and get permission, then we'll carry it on and play along. So we did. I spent about 3 days talking to them and it was absolutely fascinating. They were very aggressive, very persuasive. They gave me assurances, we will delete all these messages. The BBC will never know that it was you that gave us the login, password, security codes. That was all they would have needed. They offered me, as you say, 15%. They upped that to 25%. They reckoned they could possibly get tens of millions from the BBC if they were able to break in, scramble the system with malicious software like ransomware or steal lots of data and carry out an extortion attack. I said at one stage, hang on a minute, you could be kids mucking around. How do I know you're serious? And they said, well, log on to this Russian cybercrime forum and we'll put half a Bitcoin down as a deposit, $55,000. So I think it was pretty serious, the whole experience. And what was interesting as well was they sent me 2 links to recent cyber attacks, news articles about them, that they claimed that they had come about because of deals like this.
Yes, they boasted, didn't they, that they had had success with this sort of technique. We don't know if that's particularly true, but worrying if it is. So what happened next in the story?
Well, after a few days of talking to them, they were increasingly pressuring me to do the next step, which was they wanted me to run some code on my laptop, which would allow them to kind of start the reconnaissance mission of finding out which IT networks I was a part of, what sort of access they would have if I gave them access. I don't have high-level IT access, I'm just a reporter. They didn't know that, it seems. So I didn't want to run that command just in case it caused any issues. I wanted to talk to the BBC Information Security team. But they ran out of patience, the hackers, and they started effectively trying to force my hand. They carried out what we call an MFA bomb, a multi-factor authentication bomb, which means they tried to reset my password over and over and over again, pop-ups coming up on my phone. For about 2 hours, I couldn't even look at my phone, I couldn't use it in case I accidentally pressed accept, and they'd have been in. Of course, the danger there is, of course, with this kind of attack, is that the IT team here, the security team, wouldn't have seen it as unusual. They'd have seen me logging in abroad, not that unusual, and it could have been potentially serious. But I didn't do anything, of course. I was in control the whole time. It was unsettling, though, as an experience.
Just a final thought then, why do you think they targeted you? And in terms of trying to combat hackers, groups like this, how difficult is it to pursue groups like this?
It's really hard. People often say to me, well, how can you talk to these cyber criminals? Why can't we arrest them? It's very different talking to cyber criminals and then finding out who they are, where they are. And it's the where quite often, because a lot of this cyber criminality occurs in countries, for example, in Russia, where you haven't got any powers to go and arrest them. The reason they got in touch with me, I don't know, but I think it's possibly because I'm known, my number's out there, not only my number, my Signal number, and of course Signal is a very secure messaging service, so it would mean that they have a secure way of contacting me. But I'm still not sure whether or not they knew I was a reporter, whether or not they thought I was some sort of cybersecurity worker for the BBC. Anyway, it's a very fascinating insight into the kind of this side of cybercrime that you just don't hear about.
Really amazing story. Now, Europe's golfers have won the Ryder Cup after holding off a dramatic fight back from the United States on the final day in New York. The hosts have been trailing by 7 points before playing themselves back into contention. But in the end, Europe did just enough, clinching it 15-13. Well, the European golfers partied through the night after that hard-fought victory. They eventually made it back to their hotel rooms, albeit with sore throats in the earlier hours of the morning. Well, here on the programme, we'll get more reaction in the next half hour. I've been talking to the Deputy Sports Editor of Guardian US, talking about the behaviour of some of those US fans crossing the line, the difference between atmosphere and interference. So that interview coming up here in the next few minutes. We'll also have the latest on all of our headline stories, so don't go away.
Now on BBC News, the biggest African and international news stories. Focus on Africa.
Coming to you live from Nairobi, this is Focus on Africa on BBC News. On the program today, the Namibian army are sent to tackle a huge wildfire at one of Africa's biggest national parks, which is threatening critically endangered animals.
It's not a government war against this fire. It's a Namibian park that we are losing, and we're almost up to 50%.
Pressure mounts on Madagascar's president amid youth unrest over chronic power cuts and water shortages.
What the president said yesterday is not a solution. He did not respond to our demands. We are still suffering up till now.
Also in the program, Nigeria exports 90% of its leather hides for global fashion companies, but once processed, the label "Made in Nigeria" disappears.
Telling a story, out of Africa to the world, one bag at a time.
Many thanks for joining us on Focus on Africa. I'm Rhoda Odhiambo. The Namibian authorities are fighting a fire that has burned through a third of the vast Etosha National Park, one of Africa's largest game reserves. The fire started last week on Monday, and an unknown number of animals have been killed. The park is home to hundreds of species of wildlife, including critically endangered black rhinos. The cause of the fire still remains unknown, but it is believed to have started at a charcoal production site outside the park's borders. The government has deployed 500 soldiers to help contain the fire. The park, which is in the north part of the country, which is part of the northern part of the country, largely desert nation, is home to 114 species of mammals and is a major tourist attraction. The fire spread rapidly because of strong winds and dry vegetation, causing extensive ecological damage, the Environment Ministry said. To understand what challenges are being faced by the fire response teams, I spoke to Marlies van Vieren, a conservationist and CEO of the Nankuse Foundation, which is an organization dedicated to conserving Namibia's wildlife, landscapes and cultures, while also supporting humanitarian efforts for local communities.
So the response team, it is a massive area that they have, that is a challenge, and the natural resources. It's a national park. It's one of our biggest national parks in the country. Government has been fighting this fire now for 7 days, but the challenge there is water for sure, and then manpower. There's roughly 300 to 500 soldiers on the ground that has been deployed. But your fire equipment to fight the fire is also a challenge. These farmers that's involved, these NGOs that's involved. But at this stage, I think it's almost 34% of the park has burned down. So it is a lot of land that has been destroyed.
Now, if we look at the weather conditions in Namibia currently, does it also have a factor that it's playing in assisting, if I could use that word, the teams on the ground in containing the fire from spreading?
The weather at this stage is very dry. We've had a little bit of rain in the northeastern parts of the country, but because of the dry climate now and winds, it's actually not helping at all. The wind is working against the ground teams. And the fire also creates its own wind, and that's also a problem. And now at this stage, there's helicopters also involved, but we need manpower, we need hands in there to assist government.
So what can be done, for instance, in the next 2 or 3 days to prevent the fire from spreading and save the vegetation and the animals that live in the park?
The best would be if there is people around the national park, go support with water, food, because it's long hours, and that would be the first point, is to assist the ground teams. It doesn't matter if it's government or private, just go and assist with food and water to the manpower on the ground. And then if all the farmers around that area and lodges, tourism entities come together and make sure that we all stand together. This is our biggest national park in the country, and it's not a government war against this fire. It's a Namibian park that we are losing, and we're almost up to 50%. And if I want to make a call to all Namibians, stand together and help support the ground teams.
So what are some of the long-term effects of this fire to the country's economy and the local communities that would have small businesses inside or surrounding the park? What impact would it have in totality to everyone whose life depended on the Etosha National Park?
I think it will have a big effect on jobs, because if we look at how many tours go through the national parks, small businesses that has been created around the park because of the tourism value to the national park, we're going to have an effect there. And then also grazing. In Namibia, we are so dependent on rainfall, and especially in that area, if we don't have good rain soon, if we can control it and we say we lose half the park, we're going to sit with a severe problem with animals not having enough food. The numbers of animals are not going to decline rapidly before the first rain comes. So we're going to have to buy food, hay bale,